Good morning. If you would open your Bibles to Luke chapter 15, we'll be reading a familiar passage to us here in a moment, but perhaps consider a perspective we might not have thought of before. Mike, I appreciate you giving me the opportunity again to preach here. I appreciate that when I was mentioned I'd be preaching, you all didn't run for the door. This lesson's not going to be one of my heavy duty ones. This being February, before I decided which one I was going to preach, I'd realized it's hard to believe it, but it's been 15 years since I started preaching. This is, in fact, the very first lesson that I preached in February of 2009. After 15 years, I figured it just made sense to preach this one. Not going to deny it, though, when I dug this old sermon out, and I remembered I had spent all of February every evening looking over my notes, practicing every little thing. My father had helped me out quite a bit with this one. We ended up going over to the building the Saturday before, and I'd practiced it. And then when I looked back at these notes 15 years later, I'm thinking, really, that's the best I could do. But hey, growth is a good sign. Hopefully that's what we're all doing. Maybe we don't even necessarily realize that we're growing, but if we're trying, the process is happening. So, but yes, be assured, this is my first sermon, but it's had 15 years of updates and thoughts added to it since then. But with that said, Luke chapter 15, we'll be looking at the account of prodigal son, beginning in verse 11, where we read, "Then he said, a certain man had two sons, and the younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the portion of goods that falls to me.' So he divided to them his livelihood. And not many days after, the younger son gathered all together, journeyed to a far country, and there wasted his possessions with profitable living. But when he had spent all, there arose a severe famine in that land, and he began to be in want. Then he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country, and he sent him into his fields to feed swine. And he would gladly have filled his stomach with the pods that the swine ate, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have bread enough and to spare, and I perish with hunger." This was obviously not the plan of the prodigal son to end up in the situation that he was in. There's a lot of things that we could talk about the mistakes he had made, but I just wanted to consider one factor of why he did this. The factor that he was not looking beyond the moment. He was not thinking about past the present. He was not thinking about the future consequences of the decision that he was making. And, I bring this up because the philosophy of live for the moment may not necessarily be the first thing you think of when you think of popular catchphrases in our culture. I remember hearing that phrase quite a bit in high school. Enough to the point that I wrote a sermon about it. And, and even today, I still hear that phrase every so often, live for the moment. And you saw that reflected in, I saw that reflected in a lot of my high school classmates, whether it be, talking about getting alcohol and cigarettes, sneaking out to a particular party, going out and pranking, ding dong ditching was the popular thing. Growing up, I know my house got ditched a few times. Anyway, we could talk a long time about that. Anyway, but in thinking about that though, it's still a phrase that I hear every so often. This isn't just a teenage thing. Adults still live by this, still believe it. but it is a phrase that we need to watch out for as Christians. Now, I want to make it clear because I think this is a lesson that could be misleading, if we're not careful. I'm not saying that we just need to outlaw that statement, okay? That we live much better Christian lives if we just didn't say that statement. I might have believed that when I was 17. I realized that it's not that simple. Our spiritual lives are not a simple formula. And I also want to make this clear because I do recognize that the Bible tells us at times that we do need to live in the present. That in fact, to live in the present is not always a bad thing. I'm not in any way trying to contradict what I'm saying here, rather just to kind of see a balanced perspective. Of course, the first thing we should recognize why we should live in the present. It is true that we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. In Matthew chapter 6, beginning in verse 31, we read, "Therefore, do not be anxious, saying, what shall we eat? Or what shall we drink? Or what shall we wear? For the Gentiles seek after all these things. And your heavenly Father knows that you need them all. But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. And all these things will be added to you. Therefore, do not be anxious about tomorrow, for tomorrow will be anxious for itself. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble." We should not pretend that there is no future. So understand there's nothing wrong with having long-term goals. No. There's nothing wrong with having serious thoughts about your finances. I think planning for retirement is a smart idea. But I also know, and I don't think you have to go very far to see this, there's a lot of people, okay, in our culture that are absolutely horrified and worried about what's going to happen 5 years from now. Well, the truth is, we don't know what's going to happen. You may not be here in 5 years. The world may not be here in 5 years. Well, by all means, plan for the future, but not to the point at the cost of your well-being of today. God makes it clear that fears of the future are an unproductive path. Indeed, we could spend all of our time and energy worrying about the future. Solomon had said in Ecclesiastes chapter 8, verse 15, "And I commend joy, for man has nothing better under the sun but to eat and drink and be joyful. For this will go with him in his toil through the days of his life that God has given him under the sun. When I applied my heart to know wisdom and to see the business that is done on earth, how neither day nor night do one's eyes see sleep. Then I saw all the work of God, that man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun. However much man may toil in seeking, he will not find it out. Even though a wise man claims to know, he cannot find it out." So we can take heed of this passage here, while also acknowledging that Ecclesiastes talks about other major issues. The fact that, yes, life is temporary, that death is real, that a fear of God is a good thing. And there is a difference, understand, between living in the present as opposed to living for the present. I mean, truth be told, if our goal was to live for the present, simply pleasing ourselves right here in this present moment, a life of Christianity really wouldn't seem very appealing. As Christians, we should be aware about the temporary nature of the present, because we do recognize it doesn't take long to study the Bible for us to realize that the best for the Christian here is yet to happen. Sure, I mean there are good things about life that the Christian can enjoy, yes, but the best hasn't happened to us yet. In 2 Corinthians 4:16 through 18, I'll admit, in high school, when it all seemed so encompassing and never really seemed to end, I found this to be a comforting verse. I still do. 2 Corinthians 4:16 through 18. Therefore, we do not lose heart, even though our outward man is perishing, yet the inward man is being renewed day by day. For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory, while we do not look at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporary, but the things which are not seen are eternal. Yes, God's been good to us here in the present moment, and we would do well to maybe step back and realize how much He's blessed us with. But we also recognize that He's prepared a home for us in eternity that for the time being we can only vaguely imagine. It does mean that at times we're going to have to be a living sacrifice in the present. But sometimes we're going to have to do what we may not be the most inclined to do. But when we read the scriptures, we see that there were many great characters in the Bible that were willing to do just that. They looked beyond their present moment and circumstances. They understood that there was a bigger purpose than what they were going through at the time. We read about Moses, for example, who in Hebrews describes as choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. And then, of course, we read about Paul. And the truth, Paul had a comfortable, privileged life all set up. A switch to Christianity wouldn't have been, just a small little minor detour there. I think sometimes we don't always recognize that. Paul was willing to give all of his comforts up. He was willing to go through persecution, and in spite of the ailments, thorn in his side, serve God. And then, of course, we read about Jesus, who didn't have to leave heaven, who would live through many, many dangerous moments in life, only to end up being crucified. Could have ended it all at any moment, and he didn't, because he knew what needed to be done, because he loved us. Now, of course, it should be brought out. These men didn't do this simply because they had accepted the statement, okay, I need to look beyond the moment here. No, they were first dedicated to God. That should be brought up. But these examples, while very significant, they're also admittedly obvious examples of looking beyond the moment. And sometimes the subtle ways of looking beyond the moment we do on a pretty daily basis, but not necessarily even realizing it, whether it be doing preparations for an important day. Let's face it, no one has a time of their life doing laundry, but there's a purpose to that, okay? I know some of you were probably wondering, what was with that first picture? You saw the picture of the dashboard and somebody driving on the highway. I don't know about you, but when I was in driving school, we were taught we didn't look right over the steering wheel when we were driving. No, we tried to look in front of us, okay? So that should there be something up ahead that we need to be ready for, we'd have enough time in advance to make the right move. That seems like common sense, even to the worldly minded when it comes to driving, which is quite ironic when you think about it, because you don't really have to go very far to see there's a lot of people who don't live their life in that same way. It is not inherently wrong to be in the present, but we do need to recognize the pleasure of sin and when it happens. The best of sin, the best that we get out of it, usually happens right there in the present, before the consequences happen. Okay? Yeah. Simple example, ding dong ditching seems fun until you're caught by the police. And then you have to do a lot of explaining afterward. I mean, I know, again, that may seem like a silly example, but if anything, when it comes to sin, that's a matter we ought to be taking more seriously. Now, I recognize that, when we see a slide here, it seems so easy and straightforward to see where our priorities ought to be. In theory, yes. In practice, I also recognize that it's not always so simple. And I hope you understand this before I get into this next part of the material here. Following God doesn't mean that we're going to be free of problems. This shouldn't be something that we should shy away from when we're trying to teach others about God. No, okay? There are legit problems and hardships that we have to go through in life. However, there's also a lot of hardships that we can avoid as well. And as we're going to see happen to some of the characters that didn't look beyond the present, and they suffered for that. Probably the most obvious example is David. Okay, you know what happened to him? One bad moment of inquiring about who Bathsheba was led to another bad moment, and on until by the end, you remember David didn't even recognize where he had gone wrong. He had heard about this story. He's upset. He doesn't realize it was him that did this. It takes Nathan for him to even realize what's happened. And though David did acknowledge his sin, yes, Nathan also told him that his life was never going to be the same after that. The sword would never leave his house. And we see that that's true. But then there's another character that I think sometimes we overlook who made a similar mistake, and that's Esau. Now, we know that Esau and Jacob growing up, Esau was a hunter, and Jacob was more of a stay-at-home. He could cook very well, but Jacob was not the favorite son of Isaac. And so, surely enough, the rising tension between the brothers results in this passage. Genesis chapter 25, starting in verse 29. Once, when Jacob was cooking stew, Esau came in from the field, and he was exhausted. And Esau said to Jacob, "Let me eat some of that red stew, for I am exhausted." Therefore his name was called Edom. Jacob said, "Sell me your birthright now." Esau said, "I am about to die. What use is a birthright to me?" Jacob said, "Swear to me now." So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank and rose and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. Now, it's true that it seems that Jacob was waiting for a moment of weakness from Esau. You can imagine that Jacob's probably planned this well in advance. Yes, Jacob did make Esau a very cruel offer, but you know what? Esau did fall for it. He failed to put things in perspectives. The weak moment where he couldn't understand the importance of his birthright versus a meal. He really failed to put things in perspectives. He suffered for that. I am guessing that most of us here have not been have not experienced the same kind of hunger that Esau must have felt, and perhaps we don't really appreciate Esau's difficulty with this. While your average American might marvel at such a ridiculous trade, and yes, it was a bad trade, yes, you really don't have to look very far to see how easily we trade our relationship with God for temporary pleasures. I can tell you, I was offered alcohol and cigarettes a couple of times in high school. I never really seriously considered it. And I don't say this to, shame my classmates. I mean, I was not a perfect person. Um, and what my classmates were going through wasn't necessarily anything unique. But all that fun that I remember feeling the need to preach against at the time, all that fun from that, it's over now, you know. But we do see the effects of the result of sin all around us, don't we? We've all known people that have suffered from the effects of drug abuse and alcohol abuse. We've seen people who have suffered from that, from diseases that they caught. I know I deal with on a daily basis children that were not planned, children that never really felt loved. Now, granted, growing up, I went through in the public school system, I went through drug abuse and abstinence classes of why we shouldn't get involved in things, and here's the consequences for that. I will say there was some questionable data that was going around and how it was used. But I also remember a lot of my classmates saying, "Yeah, well, I know that's being said there, but yeah, that's not going to happen to me. Well, maybe Joe Schmo over here, but no, it's not going to happen." Where do we get this idea that if we just ignore potential consequences, that it's not going to happen to us? Okay, yeah, young people do that, but everyone, okay, all of us can be guilty of this if we're not careful here. We're not above humanity. We're not above consequences. In Matthew, now, with that said, though, okay, what we see humanity struggling with, it's not a new thing. Even Jesus' own followers at times didn't appreciate what was waiting for them in the end. They too at times struggled with just simply being happy and being and looking for pleasures in the present. But we read in Matthew chapter 16, verse 24, Jesus said to his disciples, "If anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever desires to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. What profit is it to a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? What will a man give in exchange for his soul? For the Son of Man will come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and then he will reward each according to his works." If we understand then why we should not just live for the present, how do we look beyond that? How do we do that? Well, it's just a short list up here. There's a lot of things that we could talk about. Obviously, we do need to understand the future consequences. I mean, God's been upfront with us about the reality of sin. We do well to take that seriously. We also need to accept that we're not going to live here forever. I know sometimes we hear the phrase, young people think they're going to live forever. I think in theory, they know they're not going to. It is a different matter altogether when you experience your own mortality for the first time. When I needed 3 surgeries a year back, I will say that was definitely a wake-up call. Yeah, we're not going to be here forever. James chapter 4, verses 14, "Whereas you do not know what will happen tomorrow. For what is your life? It is even a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes away." Yes, it is true that tomorrow is not guaranteed. But that's not though to say that tomorrow will never happen. We need to take warning when we hear things like, "Live life to the fullest every day." Because, I mean, let's face it, that there are some parts of life that are not fun. They are tedious to go through, but we have to go through them. They're unavoidable. So to try to distract ourselves by spending our soul on a temporary pleasure. As God's children, we can't afford to make that mistake. We also need to look from God's perspective. And I realize that when you're going through your own individual challenges in the present, when it seems like your present circumstances just never seem to end, I get it. It's easy to kind of just look from your perspective. And we're never going to fully understand God's perspective. I realize that. Still, trying to understand God's perspective does make a difference. In 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 3 through 8, let's go ahead and turn over there. 2 Peter 3, verses 3 through 8, where we read, knowing this first, that scoffers will come in the last days, walking according to their own lusts, and saying, where is the promise of this coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. For this, they willfully forget that by the word of God, the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of water and in the water, by which the world that then existed perished, being flooded with water. But the heavens and the earth, which are now preserved by the same word, are reserved for fire until the day of judgment and perdition of ungodly men. But, beloved, do not forget this one thing, that with the Lord, one day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as one day. Sometimes we forget that God isn't affected by time like we are. God already knows what the end result is for all of us here. He sees the big picture. I'll give you a little example. As of now, we do not yet know, as of this morning, we do not know how tonight's Super Bowl game is going to go. We don't know how it's all going to play out. After tonight, however, in time, thanks to retro channels and YouTube, we can watch that game all through again, knowing exactly how it's going to go. You know, even when we see a team that seems to be really struggling through through a set of innings or through a particularly rough quarter, it doesn't really set us on edge because we know at the end they're going to pull through. You know, maybe we would do well to recognize God's perspective in this, that maybe we are going through a rough time in our life. But you know, God knows what the end is for us. Maybe we would do well to be at peace with that. And we need to know ultimately what a moment is. See, a moment isn't just a moment. A moment can't define who you are as an individual. It can result in permanent consequences. But you know, tonight, okay, some team is going to be holding up that Lombardi trophy up in the air. Yes, and it will be a memorable moment for them. But there'll be moments. In time, things will settle back into a normal for them. So we would do well likewise to keep that in mind as well. Well, why should we look beyond the moment? First thing we need to realize is that there is no life without problems. I know sometimes when we're going through a rough time, we see some neighbor or some classmate, whatever situation you're in, everything seems to be going so well for them. Recognize we're all going to have to go through problems at some point in life. Matthew chapter 5, verses 44, I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven, for he makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. Don't let a few bad moments, okay, take you down a life without God. I know sometimes we might look back on our past and think, why did this one bad thing have to happen to me? I wouldn't be in this situation if this one thing hadn't happened to me. Let God take care of that. And don't let that moment define who you are as an individual either. You know, that could have easily have happened for Jacob and Esau. And it's thankfully, the story of Jacob and Esau does end on a good note. Yes, Jacob did a very cruel thing to Esau. If you remember, it was just after selling his birthright and realizing what had happened, Esau planned to murder Jacob. But then we read that this sad moment doesn't define their relationship. Genesis chapter 33, verse 4. But Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. One bad moment doesn't define Jacob's life. Not Esau's, not David's. So, in keeping that in mind, okay, yes, there's no life without problems. We're all going to have to work through our present circumstances, and that's okay, because we know that they're not permanent. Indeed, we also need to keep in mind that our temporal desires and dreams are going to die with us. We could spend our whole lifetime chasing after things, but when we die, everything that we wanted, everything that we sought after, those desires die with us. So when we understand that, as opposed to just pursuing an endless cycle of sin, we need to be ready for the end. Matthew chapter 25, 1 through 10, we read the passage of the parable of the 10 virgins. You know that 5 of them were foolish. They didn't have quite enough oil, as it turned out, to keep their lamps lit. Whereas the wise virgins, if you remember, they had enough. They weren't, however, willing to give them up to those that didn't have enough out of fear that they themselves wouldn't have enough. But surely enough, Matthew chapter 25, verse 10. And while they went to buy, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went in with him to the wedding, and the door was shut. This life isn't our destination. It's a journey that's going to ultimately come to an end. Regardless of the journey, I would imagine that we want the journey to end happily. And indeed, for the prodigal son, we do realize that it does end. For him, it does end on a good note. Going back to Luke 15, verse 18 now. I will arise and go to my father, and will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. And he arose and came to his father. But when he was still a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion, and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. The father said to his servants, Bring out the best robe, put it on him. Put a ring on his hand and sandals on his feet. And the fatted calf here and kill it. Let us eat and be merry. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and it is found. And they began to be merry. If you're here and you've suffered because you've tried so hard to find pleasure in the temporary things in this world, the world that is passing as we speak, you need to realize that just as the prodigal son's father seek to one day have his son home again, God also wants you to come home. You might perhaps be thinking, well, I've really messed up my life for a really, really long time. Why would God want me back? Why would God want me at all? But again, we read about it. God isn't affected by time like we are here. As long as we're still here, we have a chance to make it right. And since you don't really know when your life is going to come to an end, whether it be by death or the second coming of Jesus Christ, there really is no reason to delay. If you're here and you're ready to become a child of God. Baptistry behind me, it's dry, but we can fix that pretty quickly. Okay, we got the plumbing set up. All right, and maybe you know what, you're going through a pretty rough time in your life. Maybe you've gone astray, feel like you're about to. You don't have to feel alone. We're here for you. Whatever we can assist you in any way, let it be known while together we stand and sing.